Welcome to Grieving Insomniacs. This is your host, Cristi Habermann. Sorry it's been so long since I recorded an episode. The health has been getting in the way. If you're a new listener to Grieving Insomniacs, welcome. I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Cristi Habermann. 11 years ago, I lost my son, Christopher, to Hodgkin's lymphoma. And in July, I was also diagnosed with cancer. So my podcast has been about surviving grief and talking about all of the things that are involved with grief. And after myself being diagnosed with cancer, I've been talking about the impact of grief on my own cancer journey. And believe it or not, it's had a significant impact on how I view my cancer, how I view surviving it, and some of the positive outcomes of it. I know it's hard to think of having cancer as being positive, but in my case, it is. In the respect that I have a very mild case, it's forcing me to look at some things I never looked at before and highlighted some things on my grief journey that I haven't really considered or even talked about those. And I want to thank my friend Becky for bringing this topic to me for this particular podcast episode because it's been very interesting doing the research on this. So, one of the things my friend Becky said to me when she found out I had breast cancer, she said, "I'm very worried about you having survivor's guilt." And I had to stop and I had to think about it and was wondering, why would I have survivor's guilt? Well, because my son had cancer and died, and I have cancer and I'm not going to die, at least not from cancer. And so I was like, now that's interesting because I wonder if when Christopher first died, if there was an aspect of survivor's guilt in the fact that I was still living and he was not living. And so I did a little bit of research into what is survivor's guilt. So survivor's guilt is when someone else dies and you believe you should have done something about it. Sorry about that. I had to stop my recording and sneeze. I've gone on 4 months of a sickness. Anyway, so survivor's guilt is a response to an event in which someone else experienced loss, but you did not. And in my case, with my son, and I think this is the case with many parents, as you say to yourself, why couldn't I have died instead? Why can't I die? I would have given my life so my child could continue to have lived. And then there's also the aspect, at least with Christopher, at that time there was no health insurance. And I kept asking myself, so if he had health insurance and he'd gotten treatment sooner, would I have been able to save him, so to speak? And he died in Louisiana by himself. So if I had been there, would he have survived? All of those things I was experiencing, but I did not understand them in the concept of survivor's guilt. And after Becky introduced this to me, I was like, so survivor's guilt, was there an aspect of that in there? So here are some of the symptoms: obsessive thoughts about the traumatic event, flashbacks, irritable, difficulty sleeping, feeling numb, disconnected, helpless. I didn't have suicidal thoughts in the fact that I wanted to kill myself, but I definitely was wishing that I had died instead of Christopher. I was very fearful. I was fearful of something happening to anyone else in my family, especially my other son, and I was very scared of it. And then I had a lot of physical symptoms. They call them psychosomatic, headaches, stomach aches, heart palpitations. I had chest pain for, I think, at least 6 months after Christopher died. And I would go to the doctor and they wouldn't talk about it. But yeah, Also, the other problem with some of this is that if we were to go to a counselor, they would diagnose us with post-traumatic stress disorder because some of the symptoms are the same, but they're significantly different. Uh, Having a trauma from post-traumatic stress disorder and survivor's guilt. So, in doing some more research, I found some information that I thought was very, very helpful for people that are grieving and also for people that have been diagnosed with complicated grief disorder, which, if you've listened to my previous podcast, you know I don't believe in. So, in my research into what is survivor's guilt, I came across this concept of so there's content survivor guilt. So, what that means is when you believe that you did something or did not do something to cause the death of another person. So, for us parents, especially us mothers, we believe that we have to keep our children alive. Like, that is our sole goal. From the time that they are born, we're supposed to keep them alive. And then the existential guilt of survivor's guilt is that you survived even though you knew you're not to blame. And if there's an aspect of that also in what I call mom guilt, is that as a mom, we go back and we question, like with my son, I questioned, okay, so he ate a lot of hot dogs as a kid, and I mean a lot of hot dogs. So do all of those preservatives cause his cancer? We lived in a cancer pocket in California when my husband was in the military at Vandenberg Air Force Base. So being exposed to those chemicals, did that cause his cancer? So he had no choice in moving to California. That was me. All of these things I worried about for years, absolute years. And so I was like, so there is an aspect, at least for myself, of this survivor guilt. And then in the research that I was doing, I came across what's called a moral injury. So survivor's guilt sometimes comes out of what's called a moral injury. And so what a moral injury is that we witness acts that violate our moral code. What is our moral code as parents? Our children should not die before us. That is our moral code. And so this moral injury is like, in my mind, it's like the worst injury psychologically that I've ever experienced. And we've talked about it before, I have a trauma background. But having my child die is far worse. And I got to tell you, being diagnosed with cancer, and I tell this to people and they look at me like I'm funny when I say I'm fine. They're like, how are you handling your grief? I'm fine. Because my son dying was the worst experience of my life. Far worse than being diagnosed with cancer. At least right now. Maybe if I had to go, I still don't think so. If I had to go through chemotherapy and if I had to take the hormone replacement pills, I still don't think that would be as bad as what I went through when my son died. So, more specifically, on a moral injury is what causes it is there's a dissonance, which means there's confusion between the event and our pre-existing beliefs and assumptions about how the world operates. And the world that we operate in is that we believe children do not die before their parents. I mean, and we see it. We see it in the news, we see it in the obituaries, but we don't integrate that into our belief system that, hey, one of our children might die. And that's where the moral injury comes from. And so that leads us to a sense of guilt, shame, and anxiety because we believe that the world operated one way. Well, we found out the world doesn't operate that way. And now we're back to having to accept. And see, the accepting part is the hard part, if you ask me. It's the hard part that your child was the child to die. And then you get into the questioning, why me? Why my child? And then you go back to yourself, because we're moms and that's what we do. We try to keep our children alive. And I say try because I warned Christopher about the smoking. I warned Christopher about the drinking. I warned him about our family history. And he lived how he lived. How he lived was not on me. And it's so hard to accept that. So it's like, well, if I lived in the same town as him, I would have taken the alcohol away from him. I would have known how much he was drinking. I would have known, and I could have done something. But at the end of the day, the honest thing is that I couldn't have. And that's the hard part to accept. And that's where the content survivor guilt, at least for me, really fits my grief experience. And what's the problem with this having survivor's guilt is that survivor's guilt comes from a negative evaluation of ourself, and a negative evaluation of our own behaviors. And so we obsess over that, we think about all of that, and we struggle. So it was very, very interesting going into that, looking at Christopher's death within this concept of survivor's guilt. Now, move to the present time, when I was first diagnosed with cancer. I was very afraid that my cancer journey would be the same as Christopher. It never occurred to me to think about, what if I don't die? How am I going to feel about myself if I don't die and he did? And I have 13 years of medical advancements that he didn't have access to. How am I going to feel like that about that? So right now, I don't feel like I have survivor's guilt, but I'm not done with my journey yet. But having my friend talk to me about this has helped me look into it and ask myself, okay, if this is a thing for me, how am I going to deal with it? So how this ties into complicated grief is that basically with complicated grief, there's a failure to integrate the loss into the story of your life, the autobiography of your life, along with your negative beliefs about the loss of your child. So I can't imagine that there'd be any positive thoughts. Even if your child had a chronic illness, I still believe that most parents would still want their child alive. They might struggle with feelings of relief because they know the suffering of the child is over. But then there's the struggle with, how dare I feel that way, because I'd rather have my child here. Everybody wants to have their child here. And I think the survivor's guilt comes around, especially like when there's a suicide. Because as a parent, even as friends, as someone that's committed suicide, you always do the wish I would have, wish I could have, which is not helpful to yourself. And so complicated grief, all of that is, in my opinion, is a diagnosis that drives treatment. So it allows you to get payment from insurance for your grief. So I just really caution people that have this diagnosis of complicated grief to realize that no one has really done any research on what it's like to be a grieving mom. I'm just not sure why that is. And I took a lot of this information from an article, a journal article. I don't know what the name of it is. But here's the groups they did the research on, and I want you to pay attention to this. So They did research on refugee populations, looking at survivor's guilt, military veterans, survivors of terrorist attacks, HIV negative gay men, grandparents who had lost a child back in 1997, survivors of mass casualty incidents, and in medical populations. So it was striking to me that they studied grandparents who had lost a child, but they did not study parents who have lost a child. And when I wrote my book, The Solitary Journey Through the Loss of a Child, when I did the research for that book, the research on grief was being completed on spouses that had lost a loved one or had lost a spouse, so widows and widowers, and they were in their 60s. So losing a child, I lost a child at 45. Losing a child in your 20s developmentally is significantly different than losing a child when you are in your 40s. Losing a child in your 30s is significantly different than losing a child in your 50s. So someone that's lost a spouse and has become a widow or a widower is not experiencing the same type of grief as somebody who has lost a child. But there's this black hole where they haven't done research into what it's like to lose a child. So when you're diagnosed with complicated grief and you're being told, hey, I think you need to do this, or I need you to do that, or this is what the research shows, look it up for yourself, because many of it is being misapplied. And the biggest one is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. That is for people that are dying, not people that have lost a child. So just be careful of that. And with anyone, even with me, if I'm talking about a particular topic and it doesn't resonate with you, just means it's not for you. Doesn't mean that what's going on with you is not grief related. It just means your grief is different. And so with this complicated grief diagnosis, I just want you to understand, I don't even think it should be classified as a mental health disorder. Like, I understand for payment, that's why they did it. But also, someone needs to explain to me how you can explain to me that the loss of a child is not the most worst thing or a moral injury, because no one believes that their child should die or that children should die. And if they do, there's something wrong with them. So, how would you deal with the fact that you have survivor's guilt? Self-forgiveness. You absolutely have to forgive yourself. We all have different versions of I should have, I could have, I wish I would have. We all have those. And where I would start with that, and where I started with myself, is forgiveness. I had to forgive myself for the things that I believed I did wrong. Now, if I told my story to someone else and I said, these are the things I did wrong with my child, someone else is going to say, or a therapist is going to say, I don't think you should feel bad about that. Well, it doesn't matter how they think I should feel. I feel what I feel. So that's the other thing. If you're working with people that are grieving, or you'll have a friend or a relative that's grieving and they say, I feel guilty because I woulda, coulda, should have done whatever, you accept that that's how they feel and love them through it. because they have to get to this point of self-forgiveness. So you forgive yourself for whatever it is that you thought that you should have done differently. And in the research I did, they talked about cognitive behavioral models. All that CBT, I don't know if you've heard that type of therapy before. Cognitive behavioral therapy means that people believe that if you change your thoughts, you can change your behavior. And I believe that with some of those things. I believe that. As an example, with depression, someone gets up in the morning and says, it's going to be a bad day today. So they just have predicted that their day is going to be bad. So what you try to teach that person is, today may be a bad day, but I can turn it around by being present, by changing my mood, by listening to music. That's cognitive behavioral therapy. If I wake up in the morning and I say, I am sad because my son died and I had a bad dream about him, how are you going to change that, my thinking? Don't be sad? I don't think that's appropriate. He's not dead? Oh, that's not appropriate because he's very much dead. So cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't exactly work. And so in this feeling guilty, they would say, so you feel guilty in my case. So I feel guilty because we didn't pay for health insurance for Christopher. And then the therapist would say, I'm trying to think. Hold on, give me a few seconds to think. So I feel guilty. They would say, he was an adult. He needed to pay for his own insurance. Therefore, it's not your responsibility. Or they would say, I'm not responsible for paying his health insurance. Therefore, I'm not responsible for his death. Something along those lines. That's not helpful. For those of you out there that practice CBT, that's not helpful. So after Chris dying, I have learned that, especially in the situation where my child has died, that I have to work through the emotions. That means feeling my emotions. That means feeling that I feel guilty. Nothing that anybody's going to say to me is going to make me stop feeling guilty about the fact that I didn't have health insurance for him, that I wasn't there at the hospital. Nothing is going to change how I feel about that. But what I can do is forgive myself for that and say, Cristi, you made the best decision you could at that moment in time, and you need to forgive yourself. And you work on it over and over and over again. And you will still feel guilty, and you'll still work on it. Because that is parents, and that's what we do. And how many of your children got hurt and tripped over something, and especially when they're toddlers, got the cut somewhere on their head. That's a very popular thing for toddlers to do. And kids are just, and you feel guilty about it. Man, I should have moved that. Shouldn't have given him the bike. I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't have done that. And so that's how you deal with it. And honestly, time helps also. But in my case, I've done a lot of reading. What was helpful for me is, we've talked about on this podcast before, I'm not particularly religious. So I had to do a lot of research into what I believed about life and what I believed about death, what I believed about afterlife. I had to do a lot of research around that. Some people, when their children die, they already know that. And so they may not have to do as much research as I had to do to come up with a belief system that incorporated the death of their child into it. And so you're literally changing the way you believe about the world. And cognitive behavioral therapy does not address that. It tries to accommodate you into the world's way of thinking. When I firmly believe with grief, you have to incorporate the death into your belief system. So if there's kinks in your belief system, like my child died before me and they shouldn't have, you have to incorporate that somehow into your belief system, based off of your life experience and what your belief is. And then I found this other type of therapy that I think is quite interesting, and I might do a whole separate podcast about it. And um, we just got to this point. So there's a type of therapy called logotherapy, and that's finding meaning in the suffering. And I think that's definitely what happens to parents that have lost children. They find meaning in the loss. And I think of that in terms of my podcast is how I'm helping finding meaning in the loss of my son. I wrote a book. I see people doing photography. I see the groups on Instagram. I see the people doing grief coaching. All of that is a way to find meaning in the suffering by helping others. And it's very important because grieving moms have to depend on each other. We can't depend on other people to tell us how to do this if they haven't experienced it. I'm a firm believer in this, for this one especially, is that you can't understand the loss of a child. And it's just so interesting, I would say, when I say to people, this is not as bad as my son dying, and they just look at me like I'm from another planet. But it seriously has not been. In fact, I'm practicing gratefulness. So that's one of the ways that I'm coping with my grief and coping with the loss of Christopher is I'm practicing being grateful. I don't have to do chemotherapy. I wouldn't have done chemotherapy anyway, but I don't have to because of the type of cancer I have, and as small as it is, I don't have to do chemotherapy. So I'm being grateful about that. I'm being grateful about the fact that, I have a good reaction to the radiation therapy I'm going through. I am just practicing gratefulness because I can't focus on the why me's of this. And honestly, part of it is that if I said why me having cancer, that would make me somehow better than Christopher, right? I just made that connection right there, is that if Christopher got cancer, well, why wouldn't I? We're related. I actually, at the moment, have a lot of cancer in my family. It's kind of frustrating, but um, it is what it is. And so I'm practicing gratefulness. And so I'm grateful. And that's my way of coping with it. And the other part of that was, too, especially early on, I was like, if I did die um, from my cancer, it's an opportunity to see Christopher again. And a lot of people struggle with that. They're like, oh, you can't think about that. You can't think about that. Well, of course, I think about that on a daily basis. I think about how much I miss my son and I wish I could see him again. I really do. I miss his voice. He was big, arms, tall. I wish he could hug me. I miss a lot of things about him. And the other thing that for surviving your survivor's guilt is that you need to accept that because we're parents, feeling guilty about it is just part of being a parent. And I'm sorry, I think it is. I have my other son that I have things that I feel guilty about the way I parented him. I think that as we grow as human beings and become wiser in this world, that's a natural part of the process, is looking at what we did in the past and going, ouch, I probably shouldn't have done that. And I wish I wouldn't have done that. But it makes us wiser. And that's another way that I've been coping with the survivor's guilt. And with the people that I work with, I say, we don't get wise by living the perfect life. You only get wise by making mistakes. It's what you do with the mistakes that make the difference. And it doesn't matter what the mistake is. Like sometimes I slur my words because I have some issues with speech, and when I'm on the podcast, and I hear that and I'm just like, oh, ouch. But then I think to myself, that's just part of who I am. And just because I have that particular issue doesn't mean that I don't have some wisdom to share with people. And I cannot tell you how helpful doing the podcast has been just to talk about my story. So that's the last thing I'll leave you with, is I would find a way to incorporate the loss of your child into your life and into the purpose of the way you live. And it doesn't have to be on a large scale. It doesn't have to be on an individual scale. It can be just in your mind too, is how you cope. And when I go into my radiation appointments, I meditate and talk to Christopher, because I know that if he were still on earth, he would still be with me. And there's no reason to assume that because I am here and he is there, there's no reason to assume that he wouldn't be here with me. And so I just meditate. And it kind of doesn't matter if he is or he isn't, right? It's me having a conversation with him, and I believe he hears me. And that's what's matter. I'm incorporating him into my current life in that way. So I'd really encourage you to find ways to incorporate them into your life. Like the other day, I was talking to my son, and we were talking about Christopher, and he was talking about, now that he's going to be 35, it's hitting him a little bit more than it did 13 years ago, because his grandmother died and he doesn't have anybody to talk to about what it's like to be a sibling. And my husband goes in the bathroom and says, oh, I smell smoke. And I was talking to Colin, and I said, oh yeah, that means Christopher's around. And they just lost their mother-in-law, his wife did, and he did. And I told him, I said, there's got to be something. There is something that's uniquely Joni that you can attribute to her, that when you smell it, hear it, think it, you can be like, oh, that's just Joni checking in. And I said it, and it's very, very helpful. And that's the way of incorporating them into your current life. And what matters is your belief system around it. Don't try to think about whether it's true or it's not true. You just accept that it is true, and that it helps you incorporate them into your life. It could be a ritual that you do, but it's also a critical part of surviving what I call the survivor's guilt. And I didn't even realize that's what it was until my friend Becky said to me, Cristi, I just hope you don't get survivor's guilt from this. And then when I did the research, I realized I already have it. And I've been struggling with it. And I called it mom's guilt, but really what it is survivor's guilt. So thank you for listening. My name is Cristi Habermann. This is Grieving Insomniacs. Reach out to me if you have any thoughts about the podcast or any of the topics. Thank you for listening. I'll try to get back on a regular schedule. I have about 11 sessions of radiation left, so I'm hoping that I'll be back. Thank you for listening.